Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Horizon and watched the stars through the big window in front of him. The ship had been flying through space for 3 months now, carrying 200 humans to their new home on a planet, far from Earth. Jake felt good about this mission because humans were finally going to live on another world and make it their own. Dr. Lisa Carter sat at her station and looked at the computer screens that showed her what was around their ship. She was the best science officer Jake had ever worked with and always found interesting things in space. Lisa suddenly sat up straight and her eyes got wide as she looked at her screens. Something was out there that should not be there according to all their maps and charts. The energy readings were very strong and getting stronger as something big moved toward their ship. Jake walked over to her station and put his hand on her shoulder to see what had made her so worried. The screens showed 5 large objects moving through space toward them at a speed that was much faster than anything humans had ever built. Jake told his crew to get ready for contact with whatever was coming their way. He had hoped that if humans ever met aliens, it would be peaceful and both sides could learn from each other. Commander Alex Rodriguez came to the bridge from the lower levels of the ship, where he trained the Marines who were supposed to protect everyone if something bad happened. Alex was a good soldier who had fought in many battles on Earth before joining this mission to the stars. The alien ships were huge and looked like they were built for war rather than exploration or trade. They had sharp edges and dark metal that seemed to eat light instead of reflecting it. Jake tried to send a message to the aliens using radio waves and computer signals that any smart species should be able to understand. He wanted to tell them that humans came in peace and wanted to be friends with any aliens they met in the galaxy. The answer came back in perfect English, which surprised everyone on the bridge. A voice that sounded cold and angry spoke through their communication system and told them to surrender immediately or be destroyed. The alien said his name was Admiral Zex Thul, and that humans now belonged to the Kethari Empire whether they wanted to or not. Jake tried to explain that they were just explorers looking for a new home and did not want to fight anyone. Admiral Zexathol laughed at Jake's words and said that all weak species said the same thing before they became slaves. The alien told Jake that resistance was useless because the Kethari had conquered 47 worlds and never lost a single battle. Their ships were stronger, and their weapons were better than anything humans could imagine. Jake felt his heart beat faster as he realized these aliens had no interest in peace or friendship. The first alien ship fired a blue beam of energy that hit the Horizon's shields and made the whole ship shake like it was in an earthquake. Alex ran back to his Marines and told them to get their weapons ready because they were about to have visitors who did not come to talk. Engineer Pete Johnson worked at his station to keep the shields working while the alien weapons kept hitting them again and again. Dr. Carter managed to send a warning message toward Earth before the alien ships got too close. She used every bit of power she could find to make the signal strong enough to reach home and tell people there what was happening. The message would take years to get to Earth, but at least someone would know that humans had met aliens and that those aliens were not friendly. The shields finally broke after taking too much damage, and the alien ships moved in closer to the Horizon. Jake watched through the window as small ships flew out of the big alien vessels and came toward his ship. These smaller ships attached themselves to the Horizon's hull and began cutting holes in the metal walls. Alex and his Marines took positions near where the aliens would come through and got ready to fight for their lives. The first aliens came through the holes in the wall, and Jake saw what they looked like for the first time. They were tall and thin, with gray skin and 4 arms that ended in sharp claws. Their faces had large black eyes and mouths full of pointed teeth. They carried weapons that fired red energy bolts and wore armor that seemed to be made of the same dark metal as their ships. Alex and his Marines fought hard against the alien soldiers, but there were too many of them, and their weapons were too powerful. Pete set up explosive traps in the hallways that killed some of the aliens, but more kept coming through the holes in the ship. The fighting went on for 2 hours before the aliens finally captured the bridge and forced Jake to surrender. Admiral. Zexthul came aboard the Horizon and looked at the human prisoners with eyes that showed no mercy or kindness. He told Jake that humans would make good slaves because they seemed to fight harder than most species the Kethari had conquered. The surviving crew members were put in chains and taken to the alien ships where they would begin their journey to slavery on a world far from home. 6 months had passed since the Horizon was captured, and Jake Morrison found himself in a dark cell on the prison world of Kethmore. The place was cold and wet, with walls made of black stone that seemed to absorb all light and hope. Every day, the alien guards came to take prisoners away for questioning, and many of those people never came back. Jake had been questioned many times, but he refused to tell the aliens anything about Earth's defenses or how many ships humans had built. Commander Alex Rodriguez was in the cell next to Jake, and they could talk to each other through a small crack in the wall between them. Alex had been organizing the human prisoners and teaching them how to resist their captors without getting killed. He told Jake that there were over 300 humans on this prison world and that they came from different ships that had been captured over the past few years. The aliens had been hunting human vessels and taking prisoners to learn about this new species they planned to conquer. Dr. Lisa Carter was not in the prison cells because the aliens had decided she was too valuable to waste in a dark hole. They forced her to work in their research facilities where she studied human technology and compared it to alien science. Lisa pretended to cooperate with her captors, but she was actually learning everything she could about how their ships and weapons worked. She discovered that the Kethari had always won their wars by having better technology than their enemies, and they had never faced a species that could match their scientific knowledge. The aliens had found human computers and vehicles from the Horizon, and they thought these machines were very simple compared to their own technology. Admiral Zexthul spent his time studying the captured human equipment and laughing at how basic it seemed. He told his officers that conquering Earth would be even easier than taking the other 47 worlds because humans had such weak technology and poor weapons. What the aliens did not know was that the technology on exploration ships like the Horizon was not the same as the military technology that Earth kept hidden. The human government had learned long ago that it was better to keep their best weapons secret until they were needed. Exploration ships were built to look peaceful and weak so that any aliens they met would not feel threatened by human expansion into space. On Earth, Admiral Susan Blake received the warning message that Dr. Carter had sent before the Horizon was captured. Susan was the commander of the Earth Defense Force, a military organization that most humans did not even know existed. For 50 years, Earth had been preparing for the day when they might meet hostile aliens, and Susan's job was to make sure humanity would be ready for that day when it came. Susan called a meeting of all the secret military leaders and told them what the message from space had revealed. The aliens called themselves the Kethari Empire, and they had conquered dozens of worlds using superior technology and overwhelming force. They thought humans were weak and planned to make Earth their next target. Susan knew that this was exactly the kind of threat the Defense Force had been created to stop. Colonel Dan Phillips was put in charge of activating all the hidden military bases that had been built throughout the solar system. These bases were disguised as mining stations and research facilities, but they were actually armed fortresses with weapons that could destroy entire fleets. Dan sent coded messages to sleeper agents on Mars, Europa, and Titan, telling them to prepare their secret weapons for the coming war. The Kethari Empire began gathering their invasion fleet at a staging area near the edge of their territory. Admiral Zexthul commanded 500 warships that had never been defeated in battle. Each ship carried thousands of soldiers and enough firepower to destroy a planet. The admiral was confident that humans would surrender as soon as they saw the size of his fleet and realized how hopeless their situation was. Back on the prison world, Alex had managed to make contact with prisoners from other species that the aliens had conquered. He learned that the Kethari always used the same strategy in their wars. They would arrive at a world with overwhelming force and demand immediate surrender. If the defenders refused, the aliens would destroy their cities one by one until the survivors gave up and agreed to become slaves. Lisa discovered something important while working in the alien research labs. The Kethari had never fought against an enemy that used different tactics or technologies than they expected. All 47 species they had conquered had tried to fight the same way the aliens fought, using big ships and powerful weapons, in direct battles. None of them had ever tried to be sneaky or used tricks to confuse their enemies. Jake spent his time in the cell thinking about everything he had learned about the aliens and their empire. He realized that the Kethari were very good at fighting enemies who were weaker than them or who fought in predictable ways. But they had never faced an enemy that was willing to do whatever it took to win, even if that meant fighting dirty or using tactics that seemed dishonorable to a proud warrior species. The alien invasion fleet finally began its journey toward Earth with Admiral Zexthul confident that he would add another easy victory to his long list of conquests. He had studied human technology and found it lacking compared to Kethari science. He had read reports about human behavior and decided they were too soft and peaceful to put up much resistance. The Admiral expected to be back home within a few months with another conquered world added to the Empire. What Admiral Zexthul did not know was that Admiral Blake had spent those 6 months turning the entire solar system into a trap. Every asteroid, every moon, and every space station had been armed with weapons that would surprise any invading force. The aliens were flying toward Earth expecting to find a weak and defenseless world, but they were actually heading into the most dangerous military trap that humans had ever built. The Kethari invasion fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system, and Admiral Zexthul looked at his screens with satisfaction. He saw what appeared to be a primitive solar system with one inhabited world and several space stations that looked like simple mining and research facilities. The human home world called Earth seemed to have very few ships defending it, and most of those looked like cargo vessels rather than military ships. Admiral Zexthul ordered his fleet to move toward Earth in their standard battle formation. 500 warships arranged themselves in a pattern that had brought victory in 47 previous conquests. The Admiral sent a message toward Earth demanding immediate surrender and warning that resistance would only bring suffering to the human population. He expected the humans to respond with fear and panic like all the other species had done when faced with overwhelming Kethari power. The response that came back from Earth surprised Admiral Zexthul because it was not a surrender or a plea for mercy. Admiral Susan Blake's voice came through the communication system and told the aliens that humans did not surrender to bullies and that the Kethari fleet was not welcome in human space. Susan warned the aliens to turn around and leave immediately or face the consequences of attacking a prepared enemy. Admiral Zexthul laughed at the humans' bold words and ordered his fleet to advance toward Earth. He planned to destroy a few of the orbital stations to show humans what Kethari weapons could do. The alien ships moved forward with confidence and began charging their main weapons. What happened next shocked every alien in the invasion fleet and changed everything they thought they knew about human military capability. The innocent-looking mining stations suddenly revealed themselves to be heavily armed military bases. Panels opened on their surfaces and massive energy weapons emerged from hidden compartments. The research facilities that had seemed so harmless transformed into fortress platforms bristling with missile launchers and defensive shields. Admiral Blake had spent 6 months preparing this trap, and now it was time to spring it on the unsuspecting aliens. Commander Kate Sullivan led the first wave of human fighters that launched from the hidden bases. Her squadron of 50 small ships came racing out of the asteroid belt where they had been hiding behind space rocks. Kate had trained for this moment her whole life, and she knew that the fate of humanity depended on how well she and her pilots performed in the next few hours. The Kethari fleet found itself under attack from directions they had not expected. Pilot Ryan Cooper flew his fighter in ways that confused the alien targeting computers. He used the gravity of planets and moons to change direction suddenly and make his ship impossible to track. Ryan had learned these tricks by racing through asteroid fields, and he knew how to make his ship dance through space like it was alive. The aliens discovered that human ships were built very differently from anything they had encountered before. While Kethari vessels relied on heavy armor and powerful shields, human ships were designed to be fast and hard to hit. When alien weapons did manage to strike human fighters, they found that the ships could take enormous amounts of damage. And keep fighting. Human engineers had built their vessels to survive rather than to look impressive. Hidden bases on Europa and Titan launched waves of stealth ships that the Kethari sensors could not detect until it was too late. These ships appeared suddenly, behind alien vessels and attacked with weapons that seemed impossible according to everything the aliens knew about human technology. The stealth ships used advanced materials and energy systems that Earth had developed in secret over many decades of preparation. Dr. Lisa Carter had managed to escape from the prison world during a prisoner transfer when human rebels attacked the transport ship. She immediately began broadcasting vital information about Kethari weaknesses to the human fleet. Lisa told Admiral Blake about the alien ship designs and explained how their weapons and shields worked. This information allowed human forces to target the most vulnerable parts of enemy vessels and cause maximum damage with minimum effort. The first major space battle lasted for 8 hours, and the results shocked both sides. The Kethari had expected to crush human resistance within minutes, but instead found themselves fighting for their lives against an enemy that refused to follow the rules of civilized warfare. Human ships attacked from unexpected angles and used tactics that no computer could predict or counter. Captain Jake Morrison had been freed when human forces captured the alien ship that was transporting prisoners to another world. Jake immediately took command of the captured vessel and turned its weapons against the Kethari fleet. He used his knowledge of alien technology, combined with human creativity, to make the enemy ship fight in ways its original designers had never intended. Commander Alex Rodriguez led a boarding party that captured another alien warship during the confusion of battle. Alex and his Marines fought their way through the ship's corridors and took control of the bridge. They found that alien crew members were not prepared for the kind of close-quarters fighting that humans excelled at. The aliens had always won their battles at long range and had never learned how to fight with knives and bare hands. The tide of battle turned when Admiral Blake revealed the full extent of human preparation. Secret weapons platforms that had been hidden throughout the solar system activated and began firing on the alien fleet. These platforms used technology that combined human engineering with power sources that the aliens thought were impossible. The weapons created energy fields that could tear alien ships apart at the molecular level. As the battle raged on, the Kethari fleet found itself surrounded and outnumbered by enemies that seemed to appear from nowhere. Admiral Zexthul realized that humans had been preparing for this war long before the first contact with his empire. The solar system was not a primitive backwater, but a carefully designed military trap that had been waiting for decades for an enemy to spring it on. When the battle finally ended, more than half of the Kethari invasion fleet had been destroyed or captured. The surviving alien ships retreated toward the edge of the solar system, while Admiral Zexthul tried to understand how his supposedly superior force had been defeated by a species he had considered weak and primitive. The Admiral sent a desperate message back to the Kethari homeworld, warning that humans were not the easy target they had appeared to be. Supreme Overlord Keth Thane received Admiral Zexthul's report about the defeat at Earth and flew into a rage that terrified everyone in his palace. For 1,000 years, the Kethari Empire had never lost a single battle, and now a species they had considered weak had destroyed half of their finest fleet. The Supreme Overlord ordered every available warship to return to the home system immediately and began planning the largest military operation in the Empire's history. The news of the human victory spread quickly through the Empire and caused panic among the alien leadership. Species that had been conquered decades ago began to whisper about rebellion, and some of the outer world stopped sending tribute to the capital. Supreme Overlord Keth Thane knew that if humans were allowed to continue their resistance, the entire empire might collapse as other species followed their example. Admiral Susan Blake did not wait for the aliens to organize their next attack. She had learned from captured Kethari computers that the empire was spread across hundreds of star systems and depended on supply lines that stretched across the galaxy. Susan authorized Operation Bloodhound, which would send fast human ships deep into enemy territory to attack these supply lines and cause chaos throughout the Empire. Commander Alex Rodriguez took command of a squadron of 12 ships and began the first deep strike mission into Kethari space. His ships were equipped with new hybrid technology that Dr. Lisa Carter had developed by combining human engineering with captured alien equipment. These vessels could travel faster than any ship the aliens had seen before and were nearly impossible to detect on their sensors. Alex's first target was a supply depot that provided fuel and weapons to 3 different Kethari fleets. The depot was located on an asteroid in a system that the aliens considered completely safe because it was so far from any enemy forces. The human ships approached the asteroid using stealth technology and caught the defenders completely off guard. The attack lasted only 30 minutes, but it destroyed enough supplies to cripple alien operations in that entire sector of space. Alex and his ships disappeared back into the darkness before Kethari reinforcements could arrive. The aliens found only wreckage and empty space where their important supply depot had been just an hour before. Captain Lisa Young commanded the stealth destroyer UES Reaper and led a series of devastating attacks on Kethari mining operations. Her crew included Tactical Officer Steve Martinez and Weapons Specialist Amy Wright, who had trained together for years and worked as a perfect team. The Reaper could appear suddenly near an alien facility, destroy it completely, and vanish before anyone knew what had happened. The aliens discovered that their vast empire, which had been built on the fear of overwhelming force, was actually very vulnerable to enemies who refused to fight fair. Human strike teams appeared at facilities that were supposed to be safe and destroyed important equipment before disappearing again. The Kethari military had never faced guerrilla warfare and did not know how to defend against enemies who hit and ran instead of standing still to fight. Sergeant Tony Clark and Corporal Nina Hayes led human special forces teams that began attacking prison worlds throughout the Empire. These missions were extremely dangerous because the prisons were heavily guarded and any mistake would mean certain death. But Tony and Nina had trained for these kinds of operations, and they knew that freeing human prisoners was worth any risk. The first prison world they attacked was called Morthek, and it held over 1,000 human prisoners along with captives from dozens of other species. Tony's team used stolen alien technology to disable the prison's shields, while Nina led a second team that captured the guard towers. The attack was so sudden and violent that most of the alien guards surrendered without fighting. The freed prisoners included soldiers, scientists, and engineers who had been captured during previous alien raids on human settlements. These people were angry and eager to join the fight against their former captors. They also brought valuable information about other prison worlds and the locations of important Kethari military bases. Dr. Lisa Carter worked with Earth's top scientists, including Dr. Greg Miller and Dr. Sarah Kim, to reverse engineer captured alien technology. They discovered that Kethari weapons and ships used energy sources that humans had never seen before, but the principles behind them were not impossible to understand. By combining human creativity with alien power, they created hybrid weapons that were more effective than anything either species had built alone. The psychological impact of these attacks was even more important than the physical damage they caused. The Kethari had ruled their empire through fear and the belief that resistance was hopeless. When human forces began winning battles and freeing prisoners, other conquered species started to believe that the Empire could be defeated. The Zorathi were the first alien species to openly rebel against Kethari rule after seeing what humans had accomplished. They had been enslaved for over 200 years, but the example of human resistance gave them hope that freedom was possible. Zorathi rebels began attacking alien facilities in their home system and asked human forces for weapons and support. Supreme. Overlord Kethathane realized that the human problem was spreading beyond just one troublesome species. The Empire was facing the first real challenge to its authority in 1,000 years, and traditional military tactics were not working against this new kind of enemy. The Overlord ordered his commanders to use any methods necessary to stop human attacks, including the destruction of entire worlds if that was what it took. Admiral Blake received intelligence reports about the alien preparations and knew that the Kethari would soon launch a massive counterattack. But she also knew that humanity was no longer fighting alone. Rebel groups throughout the Empire were rising up against their oppressors, and the Kethari military was being forced to fight on dozens of different fronts at the same time. The war, that had started as a simple invasion of Earth, had become something much larger and more dangerous for the Kethari Empire. They had underestimated not just human military capability, but also the power of the idea that all sentient beings deserved to be free. That idea was spreading like wildfire through their empire and threatening to burn down everything they had built over 1,000 years of conquest and oppression. The tide of war shifted dramatically as human tactics proved devastatingly effective against an empire that had never learned to adapt. Captain Jake Morrison now commanded a mixed fleet of captured alien ships and human vessels that moved through Kethari space like a deadly storm. His forces had grown to include freed prisoners from dozens of worlds and alien rebels who had chosen to fight alongside humans rather than continue living as slaves. Jake's target was the fortress world of Thexdar, which controlled military operations for an entire sector of the Kethari Empire. The world was protected by massive defensive platforms and patrolled by 3 full fleets of warships. According to traditional military thinking, attacking such a heavily defended target would require overwhelming force and would result in enormous casualties for the attacking side. But Jake had learned that traditional thinking was exactly what the Kethari expected and prepared for. Instead of a direct assault, he split his forces into small groups that attacked from multiple directions over a period of weeks. Each group would strike at a different part of the defensive network and then disappear before reinforcements could arrive. This constant pressure wore down the defenders and forced them to spread their forces too thin. Commander Alice Turner led a squadron of Zorathi rebels who had become some of the most effective fighters in Jake's fleet. The Zorathi had lived under Kethari rule for 2 centuries, and they knew exactly how the Empire's military operated. Alice used this knowledge to predict where enemy reinforcements would come from and set ambushes that destroyed entire Kethari squadrons before they could reach the battle. The attack on Thexdar began when human special forces teams infiltrated the planet's surface and began destroying ground-based defense systems. These teams included soldiers from a dozen different species who had all suffered under Kethari rule. They worked together with a unity and purpose that the Empire's forces could not match because alien soldiers fought for conquest while the rebels fought for freedom. Colonel Ben Parker coordinated with rebellion leaders across 12 star systems to launch simultaneous attacks on Kethari facilities. The Empire suddenly found itself fighting wars on dozens of fronts, as species that had been quiet for centuries rose up against their oppressors. The Kethari military was designed to fight one large war at a time, not to deal with rebellions everywhere at once. The psychological impact of losing Thexdar sent shockwaves through the entire Kethari Empire. The fortress world had been considered absolutely impregnable, and its fall proved that no Kethari position was safe from human attack. Alien commanders who had been confident in their superiority began to doubt whether they could win this war. Against an enemy that refused to follow the rules of civilized warfare, Admiral Susan Blake pushed her forces deeper into enemy territory from her command ship, the battlecruiser UES Vengeance. Her fleet now included ships from 20 different species and had grown to over 800 vessels. This force was larger than anything the Kethari had ever faced, and it moved through their space with the confidence of an army that had never been defeated. General Kevin Stone commanded the ground assault divisions that captured Kethari worlds and freed their populations. Kevin had learned that most species in the Empire had been conquered so long ago that they had forgotten what freedom looked like. His forces spent as much time teaching people how to govern themselves as they did, fighting enemy soldiers. The liberation of each world brought more volunteers to join the growing alliance against the Kethari Empire. Young aliens who had grown up as slaves eagerly joined human forces and brought with them knowledge of secret Kethari facilities and hidden military bases. This intelligence network allowed Admiral Blake to strike at targets that the Empire thought were completely secure. Admiral Chris Reed commanded the Deep Strike Fleet that penetrated to the very heart of Kethari space. His ships used advanced stealth technology to approach major industrial worlds without being detected. These raids destroyed the factories and shipyards that produced weapons and ships for the Empire's military forces. Without these facilities, the Kethari could not replace their losses or build new weapons to counter human tactics. The Kethari leadership realized that their empire was collapsing faster than they could stop it. Species that had been loyal subjects for centuries were declaring independence and joining the human-led alliance. Trade routes that had operated safely for decades were now dangerous passages where Kethari ships might be attacked at any moment. Supreme Overlord Kethathane called a meeting of his top commanders and demanded to know how a single primitive species had managed to destroy his empire in less than 2 years. The generals and admirals had no good answers because they still did not understand that humans fought wars differently than any species they had encountered before. The Kethari had always relied on technological superiority and overwhelming force, but humans used creativity, adaptability, and moral purpose as their weapons. Dr. Lisa Carter's hybrid technology had revolutionized space warfare by combining the best features of human and alien engineering. Human ships equipped with these new systems could outfight Kethari vessels that had previously been considered invincible. The aliens found themselves facing enemies who could match their technology while using tactics that no computer could predict or counter. The breaking point came when the industrial world of Vextar fell to a combined force of humans and rebel aliens. Vextar produced 60% of the advanced materials used in Kethari military equipment, and its loss crippled the Empire's ability to maintain its remaining fleets. The world's population, which included millions of enslaved workers from dozens of species, welcomed their liberators with celebrations that lasted for days. Supreme Overlord Kethathane made a desperate decision that showed how completely his empire was failing. He authorized the use of planet-killer weapons against worlds that had joined the rebellion, believing that terror and mass destruction would convince other species to remain loyal. This order shocked even his own commanders because the Kethari had never resorted to genocide in their previous conquests. The first planet to be targeted was New Zorathi, which had become the headquarters for rebel operations in its sector. But Admiral Blake had anticipated this possibility and positioned defensive fleets around all the most likely targets. When the Kethari planet-killer ship arrived at New Zorathi, it found itself facing a combined human and alien fleet that was ready for battle. The desperate measure failed when Captain Morrison led a boarding party that captured the planet-killer before it could fire its weapon. The sight of Kethari forces being defeated while trying to commit genocide turned even more species against the Empire. What had started as a war of conquest had become a moral crusade that was destroying everything. The Kethari had built over 1,000 years of expansion. The final battle of the war came at the Kethari homeworld itself, a planet called Kethmara, that had been the center of the Empire for over 1,000 years. Supreme Overlord Keth Thane had gathered the last of his loyal forces around his capital world and prepared to make a final stand rather than surrender to the species he had once considered primitive slaves. The planet's surface was covered with defensive weapons and protected by energy shields that had never been penetrated by any enemy force. Admiral Susan Blake approached Keth Mara with the largest fleet that had ever been assembled in galactic history. Over 2,000 ships from 50 different species moved together toward the alien homeworld. This was no longer just a human fleet, but a true coalition of all the peoples who had suffered under Kethari rule and had chosen to fight for their freedom rather than accept slavery. Supreme Overlord Keth Thane sent a final message to the approaching fleet, demanding that they surrender and accept the natural order of the galaxy where strong species ruled over weak ones. He warned that he would rather destroy his own world than allow it to be captured by rebels and slaves. The Overlord had prepared massive explosives that could crack the planet's crust and turn Keth Mara into a lifeless rock floating in space. Captain Jake Morrison led the assault on the planetary defense grid, while Admiral Blake coordinated the massive orbital battle above the world. Jake's ships moved through the defensive network like dancers, using the tactics that humans had perfected over 2 years of fighting against overwhelming odds. Each ship knew exactly what to do and worked with the others in perfect harmony to break through defenses that had protected the Kethari capital for centuries. The fighting in space was brutal as the last loyal Kethari forces made their final stand around their home world. These were the Empire's best soldiers, and they fought with the desperation of beings who knew that defeat meant the end of everything they had believed in. But they were outnumbered and outfought by an alliance that had learned to work together, despite coming from dozens of different worlds and cultures. Commander Alex Rodriguez led the ground assault on Keth Mara's surface with a force that included soldiers from every species in the alliance. They fought their way through the planet's cities, while alien civilians watched in amazement as their supposedly invincible military crumbled before an enemy that should not have been able to threaten their world. Many of the planet's inhabitants had never imagined that the Empire could be defeated. The ground battle became a race against time, as Alex and his forces tried to reach the planetary command center before Supreme Overlord Keth Thane could activate the explosives that would destroy the world. The Overlord had decided that if he could not rule the galaxy, then he would take as many enemies with him as possible when he died. The command center was deep underground and protected by the Empire's most elite guards. Colonel Maria Santos and Major Kyle Thompson led advance teams that fought through the tunnels beneath the planet's surface. These tunnels were filled with traps and defended by soldiers who preferred to die rather than surrender to former slaves. The fighting was close and personal, as human and alien soldiers battled with knives and bare hands in corridors that were barely wide enough for 2 people to stand side by side. The final confrontation between Admiral Blake and Supreme Overlord Keth Thane took place aboard the alien flagship above the planet. Blake led a boarding party that fought their way through the massive ship while the Overlord retreated toward the bridge. The ship's corridors were filled with the Empire's most fanatical supporters who saw this battle as a religious war between order and chaos. Captain Linda Foster commanded the boarding party that reached the ship's bridge first and engaged the Supreme Overlord's personal guards in desperate combat. These guards were the finest warriors the Empire had produced, and they fought with weapons that could cut through any armor. But they had never faced enemies who fought not for conquest or glory, but for the simple right to be free. The battle for the bridge lasted for 3 hours, as both sides refused to give ground. Linda and her team used every trick they had learned. During 2 years of fighting against superior technology and numbers, they turned the ship's own systems against its defenders and used the environment itself as a weapon against enemies who thought they knew every advantage their vessel could provide. Supreme Overlord Keth Thane finally fell when Alex Rodriguez reached the bridge and confronted the alien leader in single combat. The two warriors fought with both weapons and bare hands while explosions shook the ship around them. Alex had learned to fight in the tunnels of Kethmara and in the corridors of captured alien ships, while the Overlord had spent centuries believing that his technology made him invincible. When the Supreme Overlord died, the 1,000-year empire collapsed within hours. Kethari commanders throughout the galaxy laid down their weapons and surrendered to local rebel forces rather than continue fighting a war they could no longer win. The news of their leader's death spread faster than any military order and convinced even the most loyal alien soldiers that resistance was hopeless. Captain Jake Morrison, now promoted to Admiral Morrison, addressed the new Galactic Council that formed in the weeks after the war ended. The council included representatives from every species that had joined the Alliance, and its first act was to outlaw slavery and conquest throughout the galaxy. Jake spoke about the price that had been paid in blood by both sides during the war, and emphasized that the victory belonged not to humans alone, but to everyone who had chosen freedom over slavery. The surviving Kethari were not executed or enslaved as they had expected, but were instead offered the chance to rebuild their society as equals rather than conquerors. Many of them struggled to understand a galaxy where strength was measured by cooperation rather than domination. Some adapted to the new reality, while others retreated to isolated worlds where they could continue to dream of their lost empire. The galaxy had learned a valuable lesson about the danger of underestimating any species based on their technology or apparent weakness. The Kethari had conquered 47 worlds by assuming that military superiority was the only thing that mattered in war. They had never understood that the strongest weapon any species could possess was the willingness to fight for principles that were more important than survival itself. Admiral Morrison concluded his speech to the Galactic Council by saying that humanity had not sought this war, but had fought it with everything they possessed, because some things were worth any sacrifice. The galaxy was now free from the threat of conquest and slavery, but that freedom would have to be protected by all sentient beings working together to ensure that no species would ever again have to pay the price in blood that had been demanded by the Kethari Empire.